Reports are emerging that a rift is widening amid growing tension between Prince Harry and King Charles.
Reports are emerging that a rift is widening amid growing tension between Prince Harry and King Charles. And this time, the palace did not whisper. It confirmed the impossible with the absolute force of a slammed door. Harry was no longer to be recognized as a prince, and King Charles had signed the formal succession act that sealed this monumental decision in one private stroke. A lifetime of birthright, rebellion, pain, and royal memory was pulled into a single, devastating moment that shook the monarchy to its very core. Charles read the final page of the document without speaking a single word. His hand stayed near the pen, but for a long, agonizing moment, he did not touch it again, as though the ink itself had become heavier than the heavy crown sitting on his head. The Succession Act, a formal royal document used here to decide who holds recognized standing in the future order of the monarchy, was not just administrative paperwork anymore. It had transformed into the definitive line drawn between a son and an institution. It mattered immensely because succession is the unbreakable chain that protects the crown from uncertainty, and Harry's place in that historical chain had now been cut away with terrifying precision. Far from a quiet room where the decision had been signed, Harry received the news. He did not shout at first. Instead, he simply stared at the text before him. The words were too clean, too cold, and far too final. The palace had not used soft terminology to say he was merely stepping back, drifting away, or losing favor. It confirmed clearly that he was no longer recognized as a prince within the official royal structure, a phrase that struck much harder because it did not sound emotional. It sounded permanent. For him, that was the ultimate cruelty of the situation. A punishment can be argued with, but a royal record can haunt you forever. A senior courtier watched King Charles set the pen down and understood what no public statement would ever admit. The king had crossed a line that no father could easily return from. The courtier did not need a private interview or a recorded confession to reveal the truth of the atmosphere. The entire moment was preserved in a documented palace account later circulated among senior aides, and its core message was unmistakable. Charles had not acted out of simple anger alone. He had acted because the monarchy had reached a breaking point where family pain and royal survival could no longer sit in the same room. The official palace statement completely avoided softness. No tender phrase softened Harry's fall, and no careful wording left any space for a quick repair. That mattered because royal language is usually built to hide deep wounds beneath institutional dignity. But this statement did the exact opposite. It made the wound completely official. Charles remained perfectly still after it was released, while Harry absorbed the first raw shock of becoming a man separated from the prestigious title that had followed him since the day of his birth. Behind the official words, the people who had once loved, protected, feared, and defended him were about to face what the signature had truly taken away. A royal decision is never just ink on paper. It lands heavily in bedrooms, corridors, private sitting rooms, and silent family calls where no cameras are allowed. Charles had signed as king, but the pain moved through the family as a father's deep wound, a brother's heavy burden, a wife's silent fear, and a son's public humiliation. By nightfall, the palace was not celebrating authority. It was absorbing immense damage. Charles stood at the center of it all, trapped between the protection of the crown and the child he could no longer protect. The king had signed the Succession Act, and that document, a formal royal order shaping who is recognized inside the monarchy's future line, changed Harry's place in the royal story forever. It also meant that every future ceremony, family appearance, and official record would now carry the permanent mark of that single signature. Charles knew this, and he felt it deeply before anyone else said it out loud. Meanwhile, Prince William paused outside a closed room before speaking to his closest advisors. The prince knew that even one careless sentence could sound like triumph to the media, and that was the absolute last thing he wanted. Harry was still his brother, even now, even after years of immense pain, public accusations, and deep distance. The future king also understood the massive constitutional burden waiting for him. If he questioned the act too openly, he could weaken King Charles's authority. If he defended it too strongly, he could look as if he had actively wanted Harry pushed out of the family structure entirely. So, William chose his words with the extreme caution of a man walking across broken glass, knowing that every single step could cut someone deeply. Nearby, Queen Camilla sat quietly after the announcement, watching Charles in a heavy silence that said much more than comfort ever could. The Queen Consort had seen him under immense pressure before, but this was entirely different. He looked significantly older, colder, and far more alone than he had that morning. She understood perfectly why the decision mattered to the survival of the monarchy, but she also understood what it had taken from the man sitting beside her. Charles had gained control over a massive constitutional crisis, yet he had lost something deeply private in the process. Camilla did not celebrate the moment. She simply stayed close because the king looked exactly like a father standing in the ruins of his own choice. At the same time, Princess Catherine learned that the decision had not been rushed when she saw a confidential file marked with previous warnings. The princess did not need anyone to dramatize the situation for her. The pages told their own tragic story. Harry's name had slowly stopped being treated as a personal family problem and had started being treated as a constitutional risk, meaning a danger to the stability and long-term order of the crown itself. That shift mattered because once the palace stopped seeing him as a wounded family member and started seeing him as dangerous, compassion had less room to survive. Harry's massive absence filled every conversation. His humiliation was not shouted through the palace hallways, but it sat there heavy, sharp, and undeniable. Charles carried it, William measured it, Camilla feared it, and Catherine understood it completely. This was because long before the palace confirmed the end, one private incident had already convinced the king that Harry's royal standing could no longer survive. Every royal collapse has a definitive moment that people later remember differently, whether it is a subtle glance, a sharp phrase, or a sudden refusal. For Harry, that pivotal moment arrived during a highly private Windsor succession briefing, when what was supposed to be a simple ceremonial rehearsal unexpectedly turned into a confrontation that no one in that room would ever forget. What began as a standard procedure and strict protocol ended as a dark warning. And from that specific day forward, the palace completely stopped asking whether a permanent break would happen. It simply began preparing for when it would. Harry had entered that room already carrying years of deep-seated anger, but absolutely no one expected the heavy silence to break the way it eventually did. The Windsor succession briefing, a private palace meeting where senior royals rehearsed exactly what would happen if the crown suddenly needed to pass authority smoothly, mattered immensely because it was fundamentally meant to protect the stability of the entire nation. It also mattered because everyone in that room understood perfectly that the future was being shaped exclusively around William's direct line, and Harry could feel his own lifelong place shrinking with every single carefully chosen word. Charles watched his son closely as the revised royal protocol was formally placed before the family. The king knew that protocol meant the ancient rules and customs that guide royal duty, but this specific version was not just about empty ceremony. This updated version placed William's future role at the absolute center of emergency authority, making it undeniably clear to everyone that the monarchy was preparing for a world where the prince, and not Harry, stood as the only trusted pillar. Charles understood why it constitutionally had to be done, and Harry understood exactly what it implied for his future. That was the precise moment when the entire atmosphere changed. Harry flatly refused to touch the ceremonial register. The register, a formal record signed to show absolute agreement with palace procedure, sat on the table like a direct challenge to his pride. His voice hardened instantly, and that refusal turned a controlled rehearsal into a deeply personal battle. Charles did not raise his voice, but his face changed in a way that frightened the courtiers. The king saw much more than hurt pride in that dramatic moment. He saw open defiance aimed directly at the structure he had sworn his entire life to protect. Harry, however, saw something else entirely. He saw a family deciding his whole future without even asking whether he still belonged among them. William remained perfectly still, and that heavy silence cut deeper than any angry speech ever could. The prince did not reach for the register, nor did he look away from his brother. Harry knew that the defiance was aimed partly at him, and William knew it too. The future king understood that one wrong reaction could turn the room into an open war. So he held himself completely steady, but his rigid restraint did not calm the moment. It only made it sharper. Everyone in that room could actively feel the brotherhood cracking under the immense weight of crown duty. A palace secretary recorded Harry's exact words in a documented account prepared immediately after the meeting ended. The crown may sit on one single head, but decisions of this monumental size must pass through many hands before history finally sees them. Behind the high palace walls, legal advisors, senior courtiers, and trusted family figures continuously shaped the definitive path King Charles would finally take. Yet at the very center of it all was one human image: William, standing beside a long wooden table, carefully reading the precise clause that changed his brother's future forever, and saying absolutely nothing for several agonizing seconds. William lowered the paper slowly, and the dense silence around him hardened. The prince understood that this was no longer just a family argument dressed up in complex royal language. Palace lawyers had meticulously prepared the legal language of the Succession Act, and those lawyers mattered immensely because they successfully turned raw human emotion into enforceable constitutional words. Senior constitutional advisors also shaped the final decision, meaning high officials who guide the crown on critical matters of national order and royal continuity. Their heavy involvement proved one thing clearly to history: Harry's position had moved far beyond private disappointment. It had officially become a question of the survival of the monarchy itself. Catherine watched William struggle with the weight of the clauses, and she knew exactly why his pain was so dangerous to the institution. The future king had to support absolute stability because one day, the full weight of the entire crown would rest squarely on his shoulders. Yet the man standing there was also a brother. Harry was not a stranger in a cold administrative file. He was childhood memory, intense loyalty, deep anger, and shared loss. Catherine saw that silent conflict moving through William before he even spoke a single word. If he defended the act, he deeply wounded his brother. If he rejected it, he weakened King Charles at the worst possible constitutional moment. Charles had not rushed toward the harshest possible wording. A palace aide later revealed through a documented internal account that the king resisted the strongest version at first, asking repeatedly whether the language could leave even a narrow, hidden path back into the family. That specific detail mattered because it proved the decision was not born from pure cruelty alone. Charles had delayed the final blow until immense pressure made any further delay completely impossible. The monarchy desperately needed certainty. The family wanted mercy. And for the first time in modern history, certainty won without even pretending to be gentle. Camilla noticed the exact moment Charles stopped fighting the legal language. The queen consort had heard him question lines before, had seen him push back against phrases that sounded too final, too cold, and too punishing. But after the very last legal briefing, the king no longer argued. He only listened in total resignation. That frightened her far more than open anger would have. Anger still has human heat, but this was entirely different. This was a total surrender to sacred duty. Camilla understood that when Charles went completely quiet, the decision had already permanently settled inside his soul. William read the clause again, and this time, the words felt less like legal writing and much more like total removal. Harry's princely recognition would no longer stand inside the official framework of the monarchy. That mattered because public authority depends entirely on clear roles, and the palace firmly believed blurred loyalty had become far too costly to endure. It also mattered because once the future line officially accepted the act, the rest of the royal household would naturally follow. No one had to cheer, and no one had to approve. The machine only needed official permission to move forward. Catherine stayed close to William, not to change his mind, but to steady the part of him that still remembered his brother before the bitterness took over. Charles carried the crown's heavy burden. Camilla carried the fear of what it was doing to his health. William carried the future, and Harry, though completely absent from the room, carried the permanent consequence. Once the machinery accepted the act, the fallout moved faster than any family member could control. When the palace finally began removing Harry from its official framework, the consequences became immediate, visible, and painfully irreversible. The first consequence was not a thunderous announcement. It was total absence. A name quietly removed from a briefing folder, a title completely omitted from a formal list, a palace aide correcting a line before it reached the public. Harry's new reality appeared in small, merciless details, each one proving the exact same truth. The monarchy had not only disciplined him, it had begun reorganizing itself as if his princely role had already ended years ago. A young aide saw it first and hesitated. The instruction had come down clearly from the top. Palace offices were to immediately begin implementing the Succession Act by changing all internal references, briefing notes, and formal title usage. The Succession Act, now far more than a signed decision, meant the official order controlling Harry's recognized place inside the monarchy. That mattered because royal standing lives in official records long before it ever appears in public. It also mattered because once the language changed behind closed doors, the public version would only be a matter of time. Harry's title was removed from formal schedule, and the aide froze before pressing the final key on the keyboard. The change looked small, almost harmless, but it was deeply historic. A prince does not vanish in one single dramatic sentence. He vanishes through corrected lines, adjusted labels, and official silence. The household had been strictly instructed to use Harry's personal name instead of princely styling in documents tied to royal function. Princely styling means the formal way a royal is named and addressed, and losing it made the punishment feel brutally real. Harry saw the revised wording and gripped the edge of a table in his home. Anger came first, sharp and hot, but then a long silence followed. That silence was worse. The palace had not written like a wounded family. It had written like a cold machine completing a task. He understood what the words truly meant. They did not simply remove a temporary honor. They completely changed how future records would remember him. For a man born inside the monarchy, that kind of erasure cut deeper than any physical argument. Meghan noticed the coldness immediately. She read the language once, then again, and her fear sharpened. This did not feel like one single announcement. It felt like preparation for much more. She understood that when the palace chooses words this carefully, it is rarely finished with its task. Her concern was not only Harry's public humiliation. It was what might come next regarding charities, invitations, family access, public references, and every royal connection still hanging by a thread. Charles refused to watch the first corrected release go out to the media. The king turned away as though the act had become completely unbearable in its final form. He had signed it for the sake of stability, but stability now looked exactly like total removal. He had protected the crown, yet the immense cost stood in every single deleted word. The monarchy moved forward with calm precision, while the father behind the crown carried a deep grief no statement could ever admit. The fallout had begun, and no one could slow it down. Harry felt it. Meghan feared it, Charles endured it, and the palace recorded it. But the final turning point would not come from courtiers or documents. It would come from a private conversation that stripped the crisis down to pure blood. After titles, files, and statements had done their damage, only one question remained. Could anything human survive what the crown had just done? There are moments when shouting would be much easier than silence. William and Harry finally faced each other without advisors, without palace language, and without anyone to translate their pain into protocol. The room did not need accusations. It already carried too many of them. Two brothers stood on opposite sides of a decision that had changed both of their lives forever, and for once, neither could pretend the damage belonged only to the crown. William entered knowing he could not reverse Charles's signature. The prince understood the Succession Act had already moved far beyond private pain, and Harry understood his brother had accepted it. The act, in plain terms, was the royal decision that changed Harry's recognized standing inside the monarchy's future order. That mattered because it gave official, permanent shape to something the family had felt for years. It also mattered because once Charles signed it, William could not treat the decision like an argument still waiting to be won. Harry looked at him with the kind of deep hurt that anger cannot fully hide. He asked whether William had ever truly fought for him. The question did not come as a loud shout. It came lower, sharper, almost tired. The future king answered softly that he had fought until the monarchy itself was at risk. William did not say it to wound him. He said it because the truth had finally run out of softer words. Harry heard betrayal, while William carried grief. Neither man escaped the sentence cleanly. William's tight restraint broke for one single second. The prince said he had lost a brother long before the palace removed the title, and those words changed the room completely. Harry did not answer quickly. He knew what that meant. The title had become the public symbol, but the private collapse had started much earlier in public interviews, accusations, exits, and silences that neither brother could fully take back. The act had not created the massive divide. It had simply given a legal shape to a fracture already years old. Harry realized then that the palace had not invented the distance in one cruel moment. It had merely recorded the distance that had already grown between them over time. That mattered because the crown can only survive when trust still holds the structure together, and trust between the brothers had become too broken to carry royal weight. It also mattered because William was not offering victory. He was offering a permanent boundary. Family love could still exist somewhere deep in the ruins, but royal trust could not be restored by emotion alone. William did not reach for triumph, and Harry did not reach for forgiveness. The future king stood with the heavy burden of tomorrow on his shoulders, while his brother stood with yesterday completely collapsing behind him. A documented palace account later described the meeting as brief, quiet, and devastating, confirming that neither man raised his voice. That made it worse. Their silence did what shouting could never do. It proved the damage had passed far beyond argument. Harry left first, and William stayed behind for a moment, not because he had won, but because moving felt too much like accepting the final end. The brothers departed separately, carrying different versions of the same loss. And as the private wound became a public spectacle, Britain woke to a front page that turned royal pain into national shock. By morning, the story no longer belonged to the palace. It belonged to the entire nation, the broadcasters, the newspaper stands, the crowds outside royal gates, and every viewer watching the monarchy redraw its own family tree. What had been decided behind closed doors now exploded into public life. Harry's loss of princely recognition became more than a royal headline. It became a national mirror. Harry's name moved across the country before the palace could control the emotion behind it. Broadcasters framed the Succession Act as the most dramatic royal identity decision of Charles's entire reign. That mattered because the public was not just hearing about a family dispute. They were watching the monarchy decide who still belonged inside its future line. The act, in plain words, was the official decision that changed Harry's recognized standing in the royal order. And now ordinary people were trying to understand what that meant for the crown, for blood, and for forgiveness. A single front page captured the shock perfectly. One major newspaper printed a stark black and white image of Harry beside the words, "The Prince Who Is No More." The headline struck hard because it turned a palace decision into something personal, almost brutal. Harry was no longer only a name inside an official statement. He was the face of a national argument. Some saw consequence, some saw cruelty, but everyone saw history being rewritten in public. A crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace, and the silence there felt as powerful as anger. Some people shook their heads, others argued softly, and one elderly woman, speaking into a television microphone during a live broadcast, said, "A family can survive scandal, but not a son being erased." Her words spread rapidly because they gave shape to what many could not say out loud. The palace communications team had prepared controlled lines, but the public mood moved much faster than any explanation. Once emotion takes hold, even the crown struggles to slow it down. Charles heard the reaction from inside the palace, and the storm reached him before any advisor could soften it. The king closed his eyes when a broadcaster described the decision as the day birthright met consequence. That phrase mattered because it captured both sides of the wound perfectly. Harry had been born into royal identity, but the monarchy had judged his actions as too costly to ignore. Charles was not surprised by the backlash. He had expected it completely, but expectation did not make the sound of it any easier to bear. Harry felt the nation dividing around his name, and the division cut almost as deeply as the act itself. To some, he had finally faced the natural cost of breaking trust. To others, he had been stripped of something no father should ever take from a son. The public reaction turned his private humiliation into a shared argument about loyalty, punishment, and power. The palace wanted order, the people wanted meaning. And between those two forces, Harry became the symbol of a family breaking under the weight of the crown. The noise grew, then finally settled into something colder. Charles remained wounded, Harry remained exposed, and the palace remained standing. Yet, the final meaning of the act would not be found in the anger outside or the headlines on the stands. When the headlines faded and the crowds thinned, one truth remained inside the palace. The crown had survived, but the family had paid in blood. In the end, the Succession Act was not just a legal instrument. It was the monarchy's final answer to years of rupture, defiance, grief, and public fracture. Charles signed it as king, but he lived with it as a father. Harry lost much more than a title. William gained no joy from the outcome, and the crown, though steadier, carried the silence of what it had demanded. Charles sat completely alone after the final briefing, and the quiet around him felt heavier than any public storm. The signed papers were no longer in front of him, but their weight had not left the room. The Succession Act, in plain words, was the official royal decision that separated Harry's personal identity from his former recognized role as a prince inside the monarchy. That mattered because it did not simply change how the palace named him. It changed how history would place him forever. Harry understood the truth slowly, then all at once. The palace had not merely pushed him away. It had completely rewritten the way the future would remember him. That mattered because royal identity is not only personal. It lives in records, ceremonies, public language, and family memory. To lose that recognition was to lose the only bridge between the boy born into the crown and the man now standing outside its official protection. Harry could fight anger. He could fight headlines, but he could not fight a historical record that had already been permanently changed. William carried no joy from the outcome. The prince understood that the future crown was now clearer, but much colder. The line ahead looked steadier because the boundary around Harry had finally been drawn. Yet that same boundary made the monarchy feel less like a family and much more like a fortress. William knew why Charles had signed. He knew why the advisors had pushed, and he knew why the crown desperately needed certainty. But knowing the reason did not remove the grief. It only made the grief much quieter. Catherine saw the emotional truth others avoided. This was not triumph. This was not revenge. And this was not cleansing. It was a royal amputation. The princess understood that the monarchy had cut away what it believed it could no longer carry, but the wound would remain part of the body forever. Harry's name would still echo through family history. Charles would still hear it as a father. William would still feel it as a brother. And the crown would still stand, stronger in structure, but poorer in family feeling. Charles proved that the crown could outlast a son, even when the father could not stop grieving him. That was the final verdict. The monarchy survived because it chose continuity over comfort, order over emotion, and duty over repair. Harry became the price of that survival. William became the keeper of its colder future. Catherine became the witness to its human cost, and Charles became the king who signed the line that protected the institution while breaking something inside the family forever. There is no further door to open, no hidden rescue waiting behind the final page, only the lasting verdict of a monarchy that chose survival and a prince who became history before the world's eyes. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.
The public reaction turned his private humiliation into a shared argument about loyalty, punishment, and power. The palace wanted order, the people wanted meaning, and between those two forces, Harry became the symbol of a family breaking under the weight of the crown. The noise grew, then settled into something colder,